Margaret Sullivan closed the last book of the evening and placed it gently on the wooden shelf. The community center's small library was quiet now, with only the soft hum of the old ceiling fan breaking the silence. At 67, Margaret had been volunteering here for almost 10 years, ever since she retired from her job at the town library. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her reading glasses hung from a chain around her neck. The literacy classes she taught had ended an hour ago, but Margaret always stayed behind to tidy up. She enjoyed these peaceful moments when the center was empty. The walls were covered with colorful posters about upcoming events, and tonight a bright yellow flyer had caught her attention earlier. Annual Millbrook Community Talent Show, it read in bold letters. Show us what you've got. Margaret had lived in Millbrook her entire life. It was the kind of small town where everyone knew everyone, where the grocery store clerk asked about your garden and where news traveled faster than the morning coffee could brew. She had watched this town change over the decades, seen children grow up and move away, seen new families arrive and old ones pass on. Her own life had been steady and predictable. After college, she had returned home to care for her aging parents. She had worked at the library for 42 years, lived in the same small apartment above Henderson's bookstore for 30 years, and had built a quiet but meaningful life. She was known around town as the woman who could recommend the perfect book for any mood, who remembered everyone's reading preferences, and who had helped dozens of adults learn to read over the years. The sound of heavy footsteps in the hallway interrupted her thoughts. Jake Morrison pushed through the door, his work boots leaving small traces of mud despite his efforts to clean them outside. At 28, Jake was built like the construction worker he was, broad shoulders, calloused hands, and a face that had been weathered by years of outdoor work. But Margaret knew a different side of him. 2 years ago, Jake had walked into her literacy class embarrassed and ashamed that he couldn't read beyond a third-grade level. He had dropped out of school at 16 to help support his family, and had spent years hiding his struggle with reading. Margaret had worked with him patiently, never making him feel stupid, never rushing him. Now he could read newspapers, fill out job applications, and even enjoyed the occasional novel. "Hey there, Mrs. Sullivan," Jake said, grinning as he approached her desk. Behind him were 2 of his work buddies, Tommy Chen and Billy Rodriguez. They often picked Jake up after his evening classes at the center. "Hello, Jake, how did the job interview go today?" Margaret asked, genuinely interested. Jake had been preparing for a supervisor position at his construction company. "Really well, actually. I filled out all the paperwork myself, no problem. Even read the whole contract before signing it," Jake said proudly. "I couldn't have done that without your help." Margaret smiled warmly. "You did all the hard work, Jake. I just gave you some tools." Tommy stepped forward, pointing at the talent show flyer on the bulletin board. "Hey, look at this. A talent show. Jake, you should enter. Show everyone how you can read now." The 3 men laughed, and Jake shook his head. "Reading isn't exactly talent show material, Tommy." "Well, what about you, Billy?" "You play guitar," Jake suggested. Billy waved his hand dismissively. "Only in my garage and only badly. I'm not getting up in front of the whole town to embarrass myself." "Come on, guys. Someone from our group should enter," Tommy pressed. "We can't let all the teenagers win again." Margaret continued organizing her papers, listening to their conversation with mild amusement. She remembered being their age when everything seemed possible and the future stretched out like an open road. "What about you, Mrs. Sullivan?" Jake said suddenly, turning to her with a mischievous glint in his eye. "You should sign up for that talent show. Show these young folks how it's really done." Tommy and Billy started snickering, clearly thinking Jake was making a joke. The image of the quiet, gray-haired librarian on stage seemed amusing to them. Margaret looked up from her papers, studying Jake's face. She could see he meant it as a playful tease, the kind of gentle ribbing that had developed between them over their months of working together. But something in his words stirred something deep inside her that had been sleeping for a very long time. "What would I do in a talent show?" she asked, her voice calm and curious rather than offended. "I don't know," Jake said, still grinning. "Recite poetry. Give a book report. You know everything about books, or maybe sing," Tommy added with a laugh. "Old ladies love to sing in church choirs." Margaret felt her chest tighten slightly. Tommy's comment was meant as a joke, but he had unknowingly touched on something very personal. She did love to sing. In fact, there had been a time when singing was everything to her. In college, she had been a music major. She had spent hours in practice rooms working on scales and breathing techniques. Her voice teacher, Professor Williams, had told her she had natural talent, that her voice had a quality that could move people. She had dreamed of performing, maybe even professionally. But when her father had his heart attack during her junior year, she had changed her major to library science, something more practical, more stable. She had pushed those dreams so far down that most days she forgot they had ever existed. But sometimes when she was alone in her apartment, she would catch herself humming old songs, feeling the familiar warmth that music brought to her chest. "You know what?" Margaret said quietly, looking directly at Jake. "I think I will." The laughter stopped immediately. Tommy and Billy exchanged glances, unsure if they had heard correctly. "Wait, really?" Jake asked, his joking tone replaced by genuine surprise. "Really?" Margaret said, standing up and smoothing down her skirt. "Why not?" "It might be fun." Billy cleared his throat nervously. "Mrs. Sullivan, you don't have to do anything just because we were joking around. We didn't mean any harm." Margaret walked over to the bulletin board and looked at the talent show flyer more carefully. The show was in 3 weeks. Auditions were being held this Saturday at the high school. "I know you didn't mean any harm," she said gently, "but maybe it's time I did something unexpected." Jake stared at her, realizing that his casual comment had triggered something he hadn't anticipated. "Are you sure about this, Mrs. Sullivan?" Margaret turned back to face the 3 young men. For the first time in years, she felt a flutter of excitement in her stomach, the same feeling she used to get before a big performance in college. "Jake, you taught me something important over these past 2 years," she said. "You showed me that it's never too late to learn something new, to challenge yourself, to grow." Maybe it's time I took my own advice. The room fell silent except for the ceiling fan. Margaret picked up her purse and headed toward the door. "I'll see you boys next week," she said with a small smile. "Wish me luck at the auditions." As she walked out of the community center, Margaret could hear the 3 men talking in hushed, worried tones behind her. She knew they were probably concerned. They had pushed a sweet old lady into doing something embarrassing, but they didn't know what she was just beginning to remember about herself. That night, for the first time in 40 years, Margaret Sullivan went to sleep thinking about music. The next morning, Margaret woke up earlier than usual. Sunlight was just beginning to filter through the thin curtains of her small apartment above Henderson's bookstore. She lay in bed for a moment, remembering the events of the previous evening. Had she really told those young men she would enter the talent show? She sat up and looked around her familiar bedroom. The same floral wallpaper she had hung 20 years ago. The same oak dresser that had belonged to her mother. The same routine that had shaped her days for decades. But today felt different somehow. Margaret made her coffee and toast just like every morning, but her mind kept wandering to music. She found herself humming an old tune while she buttered her toast, something she hadn't done in years. When she caught herself doing it, she stopped abruptly, almost embarrassed, even though she was alone. By the time she arrived at Henderson's bookstore for her part-time job that morning, word had already begun to spread. Millbrook was that kind of town. Jake had mentioned Margaret's decision to his girlfriend, Linda, who worked at the post office. Linda had told her cousin who worked at the bank. The bank teller had mentioned it to her regular customers. By 10 in the morning, half the town knew that Margaret Sullivan was planning to perform in the talent show. Old Mr. Henderson, who owned the bookstore, was restocking the biography section when Margaret arrived. "Morning, Margaret," he said, looking at her with curious eyes. "Heard some interesting news about you this morning." Margaret hung her sweater on the hook behind the counter. "News travels fast around here. Is it true? You're really going to get up on that stage?" Margaret began sorting through the day's mail delivery. "That's the plan." Mr. Henderson scratched his gray beard thoughtfully. He had known Margaret for 30 years since she first rented the apartment upstairs. She was reliable, quiet, predictable. This was completely unlike her. "Well," he said slowly, "I think it's wonderful. About time you did something for yourself." Throughout the morning, customers came into the bookstore with barely concealed curiosity. Mrs. Patterson, who ran the flower shop next door, stopped by to browse the gardening books but spent most of her time stealing glances at Margaret. "I heard you're performing at the talent show," she finally said, unable to contain herself any longer. "Yes, I am." "What are you going to do? Read poetry? Give a speech about books?" "I'm going to sing." Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows shot up. "Sing? I didn't know you could sing." Margaret continued checking in returned books. There are a lot of things about people we don't know. By lunchtime, Margaret had fielded similar conversations with at least a dozen people. Some seemed genuinely excited for her. Others looked worried, as if they were concerned she might embarrass herself. A few younger customers seemed amused, whispering to their friends about the old librarian who thought she could be a performer. Margaret tried not to let the reactions bother her, but doubt was beginning to creep in. What was she thinking? She was 67 years old. She hadn't performed in front of people since college. Maybe everyone was right to be concerned. During her lunch break, she walked home to her apartment, climbing the narrow stairs slowly. Her knees weren't what they used to be. As she made herself a sandwich, she looked around her small living space. The furniture was comfortable but worn. The walls were lined with bookshelves, filled with hundreds of volumes she had collected over the years. Everything was neat, organized, safe, safe. The word stuck in her mind. When had safety become so important to her? When had she stopped taking risks, stopped dreaming, stopped believing in possibilities? After lunch, instead of returning immediately to the bookstore, Margaret found herself standing at the bottom of the pull-down ladder that led to her attic. She hadn't been up there in years. The ladder creaked as she climbed, and dust particles danced in the shaft of light from the single bulb overhead. The attic was cramped and warm, filled with boxes and old furniture covered in white sheets. Margaret picked her way carefully across the wooden floor, looking for something specific. In the far corner, underneath a stack of old Christmas decorations, she found what she was looking for. A large black leather case sat covered in dust. Margaret's heart began to beat faster as she pulled it toward her and carefully opened the brass clasps. Inside, nestled in faded red velvet, were sheets and sheets of music. Her grandmother's songbooks, her college sheet music, pieces she had learned and loved and performed. She lifted out a book of classical songs and opened it carefully. The pages were yellowed with age and some of the corners were bent, but the notes were still clear. Ave Maria, The Lord's Prayer, Over the Rainbow. Songs that had once been as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. Underneath the sheet music was something else. A small, leather-bound journal. Margaret recognized it immediately. Her practice log from college. She had written in it every day, recording what she had worked on, what she needed to improve, how she felt about her progress. She opened it to a random page and saw her own handwriting from 45 years ago. Worked on breathing exercises today. Professor Williams says my vibrato is getting stronger. I think I'm finally starting to understand what he means about singing from the heart, not just the throat. Margaret sat back on her heels, surrounded by the remnants of her younger self's dreams. She remembered staying up late in the practice rooms, working on difficult passages until she got them right. She remembered the feeling of her voice soaring through a beautiful melody, the way music could make her feel like she was flying. She remembered the plan she had made with her roommate, Diane, to move to New York City after graduation. They were going to share an apartment, take voice lessons, audition for shows. Margaret was going to be a singer, maybe even perform in small clubs or music venues. But then her father had his heart attack during her junior year. Her mother had called crying, saying she needed Margaret to come home. The family needed stability, needed someone responsible to help manage things. Margaret had changed her major, abandoned her performance classes, and focused on getting a practical degree that would allow her to support her family. She had told herself it was temporary, just until her father recovered, just until her mother felt more secure, just until things settled down. But years had passed and the temporary had become permanent. Her father had eventually recovered, but by then Margaret was working at the library, taking care of her parents, living a different life entirely. Now, sitting in her dusty attic, Margaret realized that she had spent 40 years waiting for the right time to return to music, waiting for the right opportunity, the right circumstances, the right moment when it would be practical and sensible and safe. She picked up one of the songbooks and held it against her chest. The leather was soft with age, and she could almost smell the old practice rooms. Almost hear Professor Williams telling her to sing with courage, not fear. Margaret stood up slowly, gathering the sheet music in her arms. She was 67 years old. Her voice wasn't what it used to be. She hadn't performed in decades. She would probably embarrass herself in front of the entire town. But for the first time in 40 years, she didn't care about being practical or sensible or safe. She climbed down from the attic with her arms full of music, ready to remember who she used to be. Margaret spread the old sheet music across her kitchen table, the yellowed pages catching the afternoon light streaming through her window. She had spent the rest of the day at the bookstore in a daze, her mind constantly drifting to the treasure she had discovered in her attic. Now, finally alone in her apartment, she could really examine what she had found. The songs brought back so many memories. Each piece of music was like opening a door to her past. She remembered performing Ave Maria at her college's Christmas concert, remembered the way the audience had fallen completely silent during the most beautiful passage. She remembered the Lord's Prayer from her grandmother's funeral, when she had sung it without accompaniment because it was what her grandmother had requested, but it was Over the Rainbow that made her stop completely. She stared at the music, remembering why this song had always been special to her. It wasn't just a pretty melody. It was about hope, about believing that somewhere life could be different and better. It was about dreams that seemed impossible, but maybe, just maybe, could come true. Margaret sat down at her old upright piano, the same one she had practiced on as a child. She hadn't played it in years, and several keys stuck when she pressed them. The sound was thin and slightly out of tune, but it would work for practice. She placed the Over the Rainbow sheet music on the piano and slowly picked out the melody with one finger. Then very quietly, she began to hum along. Her voice felt rusty, uncertain. The notes that used to come so easily now felt like strangers. She tried to sing the first line, but her voice cracked on the high note. She stopped, embarrassed even though no one was listening. "This is ridiculous," she said out loud to her empty apartment. "What am I thinking?" But something deep inside her refused to give up. She tried again, this time starting much softer, much lower. The words came back to her as if she had sung them yesterday. Somewhere over the rainbow, way up high. Her voice was different now. It had lost the bright, clear quality of youth. It was deeper, rougher around the edges. But there was something else there too. A richness that only comes with age. A depth that young voices don't have. Over the next few days, Margaret established a routine. She would work at the bookstore during the day, acting normal and answering questions about the talent show with polite but brief responses. But in the evenings, she would come home, make herself a cup of tea, and practice. She started with breathing exercises, remembering what Professor Williams had taught her about supporting her voice with her diaphragm. At first, she could only manage a few minutes before getting tired. Her lungs weren't used to this kind of work anymore. But gradually, she began to build her stamina. The neighbors began to notice. Mrs. Chen, who lived in the apartment next door, mentioned to her husband that she had been hearing the most beautiful humming coming through the walls in the evenings. "It's Margaret," Mrs. Chen told him. "I think she's singing. I had no idea she had such a lovely voice." Mr. Chen, who worked nights at the hospital, would sometimes hear Margaret practicing when he came home in the early morning hours. He never mentioned it to her, but he found himself looking forward to those moments of unexpected beauty in his tired routine. Margaret was unaware of her small audience. She was too focused on the challenges she was facing. Some notes that used to be easy were now impossible to reach. Her voice would tire quickly, and sometimes it would shake on the long, sustained notes. She had to learn to work with her voice as it was now, not as it had been 40 years ago. But there were surprises, too. The lower notes in her range had become richer and more powerful. When she sang the verse, "If happy little bluebirds fly beyond the rainbow, why, oh why can't I?" there was an emotion in her voice that hadn't been there in her youth. It was the voice of someone who had really wondered about that question, who had really longed for something beyond the ordinary. A week into her preparation, Margaret encountered her first real crisis. She was practicing in the evening when her voice simply gave out completely. She had been pushing too hard, trying to recapture her old range, and suddenly she could barely whisper, let alone sing. For 2 days, she couldn't make a sound. She panicked, thinking she had ruined everything, that her voice was gone forever. She went to work at the bookstore and croaked her way through conversations with customers, telling people she had a cold. Dr. Martinez, who came into the bookstore regularly to browse the medical journals, noticed her hoarse voice and gave her some gentle advice. "Rest your voice completely for a few days," he told her. "No talking unless absolutely necessary. Drink lots of warm water with honey, and when you start using it again, be gentle, build up slowly." Margaret followed his advice, spending 3 silent days at home, sipping honey water and reading. She began to worry that she had been foolish to think she could do this. Maybe everyone was right to be concerned about her. But on the 4th day, when she tentatively hummed a few notes, her voice was there. Different, perhaps, but present. She realized she had learned an important lesson about working with her older voice, about respecting its limits while still challenging herself. She adjusted her practice routine, working for shorter periods, warming up more carefully, and focusing on what her voice could do well, rather than lamenting what it couldn't do anymore. 10 days before the talent show, Margaret made a decision that surprised even her. She walked into Henderson's music store, the small shop on Main Street that sold instruments and sheet music. She hadn't been in there for years. The owner, young Pete Henderson, old Mr. Henderson's grandson, looked up from tuning a guitar when she walked in. "Mrs. Sullivan, I heard you're performing in the talent show. That's amazing." Margaret nodded, feeling a flutter of nerves. "I need to ask you about using your piano for practice. The one at home isn't quite right for preparing for a performance." Pete's face lit up. "Of course. We have a beautiful baby grand in the back room. You can use it anytime. Would you like to try it now?" Margaret followed him to the back of the store, where a small, gleaming black piano sat in a room lined with guitars and violins. Pete opened the lid and played a few notes. The sound was pure and rich, nothing like her old upright piano at home. "It's beautiful," Margaret said softly. "Go ahead, try it out." Margaret sat down at the bench and placed her hands on the keys. She played the opening notes of Over the Rainbow, and then, very quietly, began to sing. Pete stopped what he was doing and listened. When she finished the first verse, he was staring at her with his mouth slightly open. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said slowly, "that was incredible. I had no idea you could sing like that." Margaret felt a warm flush of pride and accomplishment. "I'm still working on it. I'm quite rusty." "Rusty? Are you kidding?" That gave me chills. For the first time since she had started this journey, Margaret allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she really could do this. Her voice wasn't the same as it had been in her youth, but it was something new. Something that carried the weight and wisdom of all the years in between. She scheduled regular practice sessions at the music store, and Pete became her biggest supporter, always encouraging her and sometimes listening from the next room with a big smile on his face. With 1 week left until the talent show, Margaret felt ready. Not perfect, not like she used to be, but ready to share her voice with her community. She had remembered something important about herself, that somewhere deep inside, the dreamer still lived. The night of the Millbrook Community Talent Show arrived with unseasonably warm weather for October. The high school auditorium buzzed with activity as families filled the red velvet seats. Children ran up and down the aisles, and nervous performers peeked out from behind the heavy stage curtains. Margaret sat in the small classroom that served as the performers' waiting area, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She had arrived an hour early, wearing her navy blue dress, the one she saved for special occasions, and her mother's pearl earrings. Her silver hair was styled in a soft wave that framed her face, and she wore just a touch of lipstick, something she rarely bothered with anymore. Around her, the other performers were warming up and getting ready. A group of teenage girls in matching sparkly costumes practiced their dance routine in the corner, their sneakers squeaking against the linoleum floor. 2 high school boys tuned their guitars and ran through the opening chords of a popular song. A young mother helped her 6-year-old daughter into a bright yellow tutu for what was apparently going to be a tap dancing performance. Margaret watched them all with a mixture of admiration and terror. These performers were young, energetic, and fearless. They belonged on a stage in a way that she wasn't sure she did anymore. Jake appeared in the doorway, looking uncomfortable in his best button-down shirt and tie. When he spotted Margaret, he walked over quickly. "Mrs. Sullivan, I've been looking for you. How are you feeling?" Margaret managed a small smile. "Nervous. Very nervous." "Listen," Jake said, sitting down in the plastic chair next to her. "I want to apologize again. I never meant for this to become such a big thing. If you want to back out, no one would blame you." Margaret looked at this young man who had unknowingly changed her life. "Jake, do you remember the first book you read all the way through in my class?" "Of course. Of Mice and Men. Took me 3 weeks. Do you remember what you told me when you finished it?" Jake thought for a moment. I said it was the first time I realized I could do something I never thought I could do. Exactly. Margaret patted his hand gently. Tonight is my Of Mice and Men moment. The show began at 7 o'clock sharp. Principal Johnson served as the host, introducing each act with enthusiasm that seemed genuine, even for the less polished performances. Margaret was scheduled to perform 8 out of 12 acts right after intermission. She watched the first half of the show from the wings, her stomach tight with nerves. The teenage dance group was energetic and well-rehearsed, earning enthusiastic applause from their families. The 2 boys with guitars performed a song Margaret didn't recognize, but the audience clearly loved it. A middle-aged man did a comedy routine that had everyone laughing. During intermission, Margaret stepped outside for fresh air. The autumn evening was crisp and she could see her breath in small puffs. Through the auditorium windows, she could see the crowd. Nearly every seat was filled. Word had spread about her participation, and it seemed like half the town had come to see what would happen. Mrs. Chen from next door spotted her through the window and waved encouragingly. Old Mr. Henderson was there with his wife, sitting in the 3rd row. Even Dr. Martinez had come, along with several of her former literacy students. "You can do this," Margaret whispered to herself. The same phrase she had repeated countless times over the past 3 weeks. When intermission ended, Margaret took her place in the wings. Her heart was beating so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. The acts before her seemed to pass in a blur. A young girl played violin beautifully. A group of seniors from the high school performed a funny skit that had the audience roaring with laughter. Then Principal Johnson's voice came over the microphone. "Our next performer is someone very special to our community. For years, she's helped countless people discover the joy of reading through her literacy classes at the community center. Tonight, she's sharing a different kind of gift with us. Please welcome Margaret Sullivan." The applause was warm and encouraging as Margaret walked onto the stage. The bright lights made it impossible to see individual faces in the audience, which was both comforting and terrifying. She had practiced this walk 100 times in her apartment, but the stage felt enormous under her feet. Young Pete Henderson was at the piano, ready to accompany her. He had volunteered for the job after hearing her practice at his music store. He gave her a reassuring nod and smiled. Margaret approached the microphone at center stage. For a moment, she just stood there looking out at the sea of faces she couldn't quite see. The auditorium was completely quiet. No coughing, no whispering, no rustling programs. Everyone was waiting. She leaned slightly toward the microphone. "When I was in college," she began, her voice clear and steady despite her nerves, "I dreamed of singing for people. Life took me in a different direction, and I put that dream away for 40 years. 3 weeks ago, a young friend challenged me to dust off that dream. This song is for him, and for anyone who's ever wondered if it's too late to try something new." Pete played the opening notes, the familiar melody filling the auditorium. Margaret closed her eyes for just a moment, remembering all the hours of practice, all the years of silence, all the dreams she had carried quietly in her heart. Then she began to sing. "Somewhere over the rainbow, way up high," her voice started softly, almost tentatively, but it grew stronger with each word. The years had changed her voice, but they had also given it something new, a depth and richness that spoke of experience, of loss, of hope maintained through difficult times. "There's a land that I heard of once in a lullaby." As she continued, something magical happened. Margaret stopped thinking about the audience, stopped worrying about hitting every note perfectly, stopped being afraid. She was simply telling a story through song, sharing the hope and longing that had lived in her heart for so many years. "Somewhere over the rainbow, skies are blue." When she reached the bridge of the song, her voice soared with a power that surprised even her. The note hung in the air, pure and strong, carrying with it all the dreams she had set aside and all the courage it had taken to reclaim them. "If happy little bluebirds fly beyond the rainbow, why, oh why can't I?" The final note faded into complete silence. For what felt like an eternity, nobody moved. Margaret stood at the microphone, suddenly aware again of where she was, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. Then someone in the back row stood up. Then another person. Then another. Within seconds, the entire auditorium was on its feet, applauding with an enthusiasm that Margaret had never experienced in her life. The applause went on and on. People were cheering, some were crying, and many were smiling so widely that Margaret could see them even through the bright stage lights. She stood there overwhelmed as wave after wave of appreciation washed over her. Jake was in the front row, clapping so hard his hands must have hurt, tears streaming down his face. Pete Henderson had left the piano bench and was applauding too, grinning from ear to ear. Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in 40 years, the pure joy of sharing her gift with others, of connecting with people through music in a way that words alone could never achieve. She had remembered who she was meant to be. Margaret walked off the stage on unsteady legs, her heart still racing from the incredible response of the audience. The standing ovation had lasted for what felt like 10 minutes, though it was probably closer to 3. Even now, as the next performer took the stage, she could hear people in the audience still talking excitedly about her performance. Pete Henderson caught up with her backstage, his face glowing with excitement. "Mrs. Sullivan, that was absolutely incredible. I got goosebumps and I've heard you practice that song dozens of times." Before Margaret could respond, Jake appeared with his girlfriend Linda and several other people from her literacy classes. They surrounded her with hugs and congratulations, their faces full of pride and amazement. "I can't believe you've been hiding that voice all these years," Linda said, wiping tears from her eyes. "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." Margaret felt overwhelmed by all the attention. For so many years she had lived quietly, going about her daily routine without much fanfare. Now suddenly everyone wanted to talk to her, to congratulate her, to tell her how her performance had affected them. The rest of the talent show passed in a blur. Margaret tried to focus on the remaining performers, but people kept approaching her during the final acts. Mrs. Patterson from the flower shop squeezed her hand and whispered, "You gave me chills, dear. Absolute chills." Dr. Martinez stopped by to tell her that her performance had reminded him why he had become a doctor, to help people discover what was possible for them. Even teenagers she barely knew came up to her, saying things like, "That was so cool. Mrs. Sullivan, I had no idea old people could be so awesome." When the show ended and they announced the winners, Margaret was shocked to hear her name called for first place. The audience erupted again as she walked back onto the stage to accept a small trophy and a gift certificate to Pete's music store. Standing there with the microphone in her hand, she looked out at all the familiar faces, her neighbors, her students, people she had known for decades. "I don't quite know what to say," she began, her voice still a little shaky from emotion. "3 weeks ago I thought my performing days were long behind me. Tonight you've all reminded me that it's never too late to surprise yourself. Thank you for listening and thank you for believing in me." After the show, Margaret found herself surrounded by people in the lobby of the high school. Everyone wanted to talk to her, to shake her hand, to tell her their own stories about dreams they had set aside. Mrs. Chen, her neighbor, pulled her aside. "Margaret, I have to confess something. I've been hearing you practice through the walls for weeks. Every evening I would stop whatever I was doing just to listen. Your voice has been the most beautiful part of my day." An elderly man Margaret barely knew introduced himself as Robert, a retired teacher. "My wife dragged me here tonight," he said with a grin. "I thought it would be boring, just kids singing pop songs. But your performance, it made me think about the piano gathering dust in my living room. I used to play, you know. Maybe it's time I started again." As the crowd gradually thinned out, Margaret found herself walking to her car with Jake and Linda. The autumn air was cool and refreshing after the warmth of the crowded auditorium. "Mrs. Sullivan," Jake said quietly, "I owe you an apology and a thank you." "What do you mean?" "When I suggested you enter the talent show, it was just a joke. I was being thoughtless. But watching you up there tonight, I realized you taught me something even more important than reading. You showed me that being brave isn't about not being scared. It's about doing something meaningful even when you're scared." Over the following days, Margaret's life changed in ways she never could have imagined. Word of her performance spread quickly through Millbrook and beyond. Someone had recorded her performance on their phone and posted it online, where it was viewed thousands of times within the first week. The local newspaper wanted to do a story about her. The radio station called to ask if she would be interviewed. A retirement community 2 towns over invited her to perform at their monthly social event. But the most meaningful changes were the smaller, more personal ones. Mrs. Chen knocked on her door one evening and asked if Margaret would teach her to sing. "I've always wanted to learn," she said shyly. "But I thought I was too old to start." Robert, the retired teacher from the talent show, stopped by the bookstore to tell her he had started playing piano again. "Every day for the past week," he said proudly. "My fingers are stiff and I make mistakes, but it feels wonderful to make music again." Margaret began offering informal voice lessons in her apartment on Sunday afternoons. Word spread, and soon she had a small group of adults who gathered weekly to learn together. They called themselves the Silver Voices, and they ranged in age from 45 to 82. The group included several surprises. Mrs. Patterson, from the flower shop, had a lovely alto voice that had never been trained but was naturally beautiful. Mr. Henderson, from the bookstore, turned out to have a rich bass voice that added depth to their group harmonies. Even Dr. Martinez joined them, saying that singing was the best stress relief he had found after long days at the hospital. Father Williams from St. Mary's Church heard about Margaret's newfound musical activities and asked if she would consider joining the church choir. "We could use someone with your experience to help guide the group," he said. Margaret accepted, and for the first time in 40 years she was singing in church again. 6 months after the talent show, Margaret reflected on how much her life had changed. She was busier than she had been in years, but it was a different kind of busy. Instead of just filling time with routine activities, she was filled with purpose and joy. The Silver Voices had grown to 12 members, and they had even performed at several community events. Margaret had discovered that teaching music was almost as fulfilling as performing it. Watching others discover their voices, seeing their confidence grow, helping them overcome their fears. It reminded her of her literacy work, but with an added dimension of pure beauty. Jake stopped by the community center one evening after one of the Silver Voices rehearsals. He listened from the hallway as the group worked through a beautiful arrangement of Amazing Grace, with Margaret's voice weaving through the harmonies. "Like a silver thread, you know," he told her afterward. "When I made that joke about you entering the talent show, I thought I was being funny. I had no idea I was helping you find your way home." Margaret smiled, thinking about all the unexpected turns life could take, about dreams that could be lost and found again, about the courage that could emerge from the most unlikely places. "Sometimes," she said, "the best journeys are the ones we never planned to take." That night, as Margaret prepared for bed, she looked at the small trophy from the talent show sitting on her dresser. Next to it were photos from the Silver Voices performances, letters from people who had been inspired by her story, and a new piece of sheet music she was learning for next Sunday's church service. At 67, Margaret Sullivan had discovered that her most beautiful chapter was just beginning.